Welcome to Time Before Us, the channel where ancient history breathes again. Before time had a name, before the first human breath, there existed a world fierce, forgotten, and alive. Creatures of scale and silence, predators wrapped in. Feathers, titans that shook the earth. Lives erased, bones buried beneath eternity. But they are not lost. They are waiting. This is Time Before Us, where prehistoric worlds rise again, and the stories buried in stone finally speak. Chapter 1. The Supercontinent's Birth. Roughly 335 million years ago, Earth was a world in transition. The continents we recognize today, North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Australia, and Antarctica were scattered fragments, drifting across a restless planet. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, these drifting pieces began to converge. They were not static, immovable foundations. They were colossal rafts of rock, carried by the deep, convecting currents of molten mantle beneath them. This slow, relentless motion plate, tectonics, was sculpting the stage for one of the most extraordinary geological events in history, the birth of the supercontinent Pangea. The name Pangea comes from the Greek words pan, all, and Gaia, earth, and it perfectly describes the scale of what was coming. For millions of years, the continents crept toward each other, as if pulled by some invisible force. Oceans shrank. Shorelines crumpled. Mountain ranges rose where coasts once met open water. And piece by piece, the jigsaw puzzle of our planet locked together into a single, unbroken landmass that stretched from the northernmost reaches of the globe to the icy edges of the southern pole. To truly appreciate the magnitude of this event, imagine looking at a map of the modern world. Erase the Atlantic Ocean. Slide Africa and South America back together until their coastlines fit like puzzle pieces. Push North America eastward, tucking it against Europe. Bring India back down into the southern hemisphere, wedged against Madagascar. Now, instead of scattered continents separated by vast oceans, you see a world dominated by a single continent, ringed by one colossal ocean. That was Pangea. The journey to the supercontinent was neither quick nor simple. It was the climax of a much older cycle that geologists call the supercontinent cycle. Long before Pangea, there had been other supercontinents with names like Rodinia and Columbia. Each had come together through the same slow dance of tectonic plates and later split apart, scattering landmasses that would one day reunite in a different configuration. Earth's crust, it seems, has always had a rhythm: collide, unite, fracture, scatter, and collide again. In the case of Pangea, the story begins with two massive continental groups, Laurasia to the north and Gondwana to the south. Gondwana was already enormous, consisting of what would become South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia. Laurasia included pieces of what we now call North America, Europe, and parts of Asia. Separating them was an ancient ocean known as the Rheic Ocean. For millions of years, waves crashed on its shores, but beneath its waters, tectonic plates were shifting. Slowly, the floor of the Rheic was being consumed by subduction zones, places where one plate dives beneath another and sinks into the mantle. And as that ocean shrank, Gondwana and Laurasia crept closer, destined to collide. The collision was anything but gentle. Picture the slow-motion crash of continents, coastlines crumpling, seabeds thrust upward, and layers of crust folding over each other like a rug pushed against a wall. This violent embrace forged mountains that still stand today. The Appalachians, stretching down the eastern United States, are among Pangea's greatest scars, remnants of the colossal collision that stitched together Laurasia and Gondwana. Across the Atlantic, the Anti-Atlas Mountains of Morocco tell the same story. They are the opposite edges of a single mountain belt, torn apart only when the Atlantic Ocean later opened and split them. When the final sutures sealed, Earth was transformed. Nearly all of its land was fused together into a single giant. To the west stretched the Pangea Ocean, vast and seemingly endless, covering much of the globe. To the east lay a smaller but significant sea, the Tethys Ocean, which would one day give rise to the Mediterranean. Pangea was so massive that it dominated Earth's climate, ecosystems, and even its evolutionary future. But what did this newly forged supercontinent look like? Imagine endless stretches of arid interior deserts, dry and scorching, where moisture rarely penetrated so far inland. On its fringes, where land met ocean, climates were more temperate, with lush coastal forests and swampy lowlands teeming with life. The interior of Pangea was so vast that weather systems often failed to bring rainfall deep into its heart, leaving it parched and extreme. In some places, sand dunes the size of skyscrapers marched across the horizon, creating deserts more severe than the Sahara. Yet this immense landmass was not lifeless. Far from it. Primitive forests blanketed large swaths of Pangea, home to towering trees like lepidodendron and sigillaria, strange, spindly plants that seem alien compared to modern vegetation. In the swamps, giant amphibians lurked, while early reptiles scuttled across dry land. By the time dinosaurs arrived tens of millions of years later, Pangea would already be fully formed, providing them a continuous land highway that stretched from pole to pole. The unification of Earth's land also carried deeper consequences for evolution. With so few barriers, species could spread across vast ranges, mingling with little restriction. This global connectedness initially created widespread uniformity. Many creatures lived across entire continents, unchallenged by geographical limits. But this balance was precarious. The very forces that had stitched Pangea together were still at work beneath its crust, restless and unstoppable. Though it seemed eternal, Pangea's unity was temporary. Its lifespan measured in tens of millions of years. The creation of Pangea stands as one of the most dramatic turning points in Earth's history. It was the climax of a geological saga millions of years in the making. It set the stage for the rise of dinosaurs, the spread of new ecosystems, and ultimately, the next great upheaval, the breaking apart of the supercontinent. To understand how and why Pangea eventually cracked, we first have to appreciate its extraordinary birth, the story of a world drawn together by the immense, invisible power of the planet itself. Chapter 2, A World Without Borders. When Pangea finally locked into place, it wasn't just another landmass on Earth's surface. It was the landmass, a continent so vast and uninterrupted that the idea of national borders, regions, or even the separation of hemispheres would have made no sense at all. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, the world was unified under one colossal stretch of land. And with this unity came a way of life, a climate, and an ecosystem unlike anything we see on Earth today. Imagine standing in the middle of Pangea. To walk from one edge of the supercontinent to the other would be like traversing half the planet. There were no Atlantic or Indian Oceans to break the journey, only endless deserts, rivers, forests, and mountain chains rolling into the horizon. To its north, ice and tundra stretched into the polar caps. To its south, vast arid plains reached the frozen edge of the southern pole. And across its center, deep inland, lay regions so far from the sea that rain clouds rarely survived the journey, leaving behind some of the driest, harshest deserts in Earth's history. This was a world without borders, not just politically, but environmentally. With so much of Earth's land fused together, climates didn't distribute themselves the way they do today. Oceans play a crucial role in regulating temperature and rainfall, but on Pangea, most of the land sat far from the moderating influence of the sea. As a result, Pangea's climate was extreme. Its interior baked under the relentless sun, while its edges, closer to ocean breezes, were far more habitable. In this sense, Pangea was a place of contrasts, fertile coastal lowlands fringed with swampy forests on one side, and scorching continental interiors on the other. But despite these extremes, life flourished. In the swampy deltas and floodplains, dense forests rose, dominated by towering club mosses and giant horsetails, plants that seem primitive by today's standards, but once grew as tall as apartment buildings. These forests were humid and lush, home to early reptiles, amphibians, and insects of staggering proportions. Dragonflies the size of hawks buzzed through the air, feeding on swarms of smaller insects. Millipedes longer than a man's arm crawled through the leaf litter, while amphibians as large as crocodiles lurked beneath still waters. And then there were the reptiles. These weren't yet the dinosaurs we imagine when we think of prehistoric worlds, but their ancestors, small, scaly creatures experimenting with life on land in new ways. Pangea gave them freedom. With no oceans cutting them off, species could spread across immense distances, adapting to deserts, forests, rivers, and coastlines as they went. This free passage across a unified landmass allowed creatures to expand their ranges and evolve in ways that would have been impossible on smaller, separated continents. From a geological perspective, Pangea's world without borders also tells us something about the Earth's inner workings. The mountain belts formed by continental collisions stretched for thousands of miles, creating chains like the central Pangean Mountains, which may have rivaled the modern Himalayas in height. These ranges weren't confined to one continent or region. They spanned the heart of Pangea itself, physical monuments to the collision of Gondwana and Laurasia. The land was stitched together, and the seams showed. For humans today, the idea of such a vast and unified world is almost impossible to imagine. Our modern maps are defined by oceans, coastlines, and borders. We think of Earth as divided by land, by water, by nations. Pangea obliterates that notion. It was Earth's ultimate reset button. One continent, one ocean, one planetary system. If you could look down at the Earth from space during Pangea's reign, you wouldn't see familiar outlines of continents. You'd see a massive brownish-green continent surrounded by the deep, endless blue of Panthalassa, the single-world ocean. To the east, the smaller Tethys Ocean curled along Pangea's edge, but otherwise, there was nothing but water. And yet, this world without borders also created challenges. Because species could spread so widely, ecosystems were strangely uniform. Fossils of the same reptile species have been found on opposite ends of the supercontinent, thousands of miles apart. While this might sound like paradise for animals, it also meant less isolation, less opportunity for unique evolutionary experiments. When environments are too connected, evolution tends to slow down. Diversity suffers. Ironically, the very unity that made Pangea extraordinary also limited life's creative potential, at least for a while. Still, the absence of borders didn't mean the absence of danger. Pangea's interior deserts were punishing, and survival required adaptation to extremes. Rivers that carved through arid plains were lifelines for countless species, much like the Nile today is for Egypt. These water networks formed natural highways, connecting ecosystems across vast stretches of land. Migratory animals likely followed these routes in seasonal patterns, creating rhythms of movement that mirrored the pulse of the land itself. But perhaps the most striking thing about Pangea was how it redefined Earth's climate system. The sheer size of the continent disrupted atmospheric circulation. Winds moved differently across such an expanse of land. Storms formed and died in unusual patterns. Some scientists believe that the monsoon systems that swept across parts of Pangea were stronger and more violent than anything we experience today, bringing seasonal floods that alternated with years of devastating drought. This unpredictability shaped the lives of every plant and animal that called the supercontinent home. And yet, in all its extremes, Pangea offered something remarkable, a glimpse of Earth at its most unified. It was the canvas upon which the greatest evolutionary dramas of the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras would unfold. The reptiles that scurried across its deserts, the amphibians that lurked in its swamps, The forests that rose in its fertile valleys, all of them were part of a single interconnected world. When the first dinosaurs appeared, they inherited a planet where the land was open, continuous, and boundless. For millions of years, they would thrive in this borderless world, roaming from one end of Pangea to the other. But unity comes with fragility. The same tectonic forces that had pulled Pangea together were still moving beneath the surface. The supercontinent may have looked permanent, but deep within the Earth, restless energy was already building. Eventually, that energy would begin to tear Pangea apart, creating the very oceans and continents we know today. For now, though, Earth stood at the height of its unity, a world without borders. One land beneath the sun. Chapter 3. Creatures of the unified land when Pangea stood in its prime. It wasn't just the land and oceans that made this world remarkable, it was the creatures that called it home. From the smallest insects to the largest reptiles, life thrived in ways both familiar and alien. But unlike today, where oceans divide animals into distinct continents, Pangea offered a continuous playground. A lizard could scuttle across landscapes that stretched for thousands of miles. A predator's territory was limited only by the endurance of its legs and the availability of prey. In this chapter, we step into that living world, the world of creatures that knew no borders. A stage set for life by the late Paleozoic and early Mesozoic eras. When Pangea was fully assembled, ecosystems stretched seamlessly across continents. In today's world, isolation fosters diversity: marsupials in Australia, lemurs in Madagascar, giant anteaters in South America. But in Pangea, there were no such isolated laboratories. Instead, animals spread far and wide, creating broad, uniform ecosystems. Fossil evidence shows the same species of reptile appearing in what is now Africa, South America, and Europe. Proof that creatures roamed a land without boundaries. This interconnectedness meant survival strategies had to be flexible. In the lush wetlands along rivers and coastlines, amphibians thrived. These were not the small frogs and salamanders we know today, but giants some as long as cars, with wide, flat skulls and tooth-lined jaws. They lurked in the shallows, ambushing prey much like modern crocodiles. The group known as temnospondyls dominated these environments, ruling freshwater ecosystems for millions of years. Meanwhile, in the drier interior, early reptiles carved out new niches. Small, lizard-like creatures scurried across the sands, while larger, more specialized predators stalked them. One such predator was Dimetrodon, a sail-backed reptile often mistaken for a dinosaur, but actually belonging to a much older lineage, known as synapsids, the ancestors of mammals. With a sprawling gait and massive jaws filled with serrated teeth, Dimetrodon was among the apex predators of its time, preying on anything it could overpower. Its iconic sail, formed by elongated spines along its back, may have helped regulate body temperature or served as a display to intimidate rivals and attract mates. Giants and oddities. Pangea's connected landscapes also nurtured some truly bizarre forms of life. Imagine the forests of that time: towering trees, fern-like plants, and vast swamps filled with strange creatures. Giant insects dominated the skies. Dragonflies with wingspans of more than 2 feet buzzed through the humid air. Millipedes longer than a human stretched across the forest floor. These oversized arthropods thrived in an atmosphere rich in oxygen, which allowed their bodies to grow larger than their modern descendants ever could. Dot in the rivers and lakes, enormous fish patrolled the waters. Some, like the armored placodonts, developed crushing jaws to feed on shellfish, while others became swift predators armed with rows of sharp teeth. These aquatic creatures blurred the line between ancient and modern, looking like half-formed prototypes of the reptiles that would later dominate the seas. Among the strangest land dwellers of Pangea were the parasaurs, large, bulky herbivores with bony armor and blunt heads. They looked almost like a cross between a lizard and a rhinoceros, lumbering through forests in search of plants to graze. Some species reached lengths of up to 10 feet, protected from predators by their sheer size and defensive armor. They weren't elegant, but they were survivors, proof that odd body plans often succeed in nature. The rise of archosaurs. The Mesozoic era dawned. A new group began to rise, the archosaurs, the ancestors of crocodiles, pterosaurs, and dinosaurs. These early archosaurs were small at first, agile predators with upright postures that gave them an advantage over the sprawling reptiles of the past. They could move faster, breathe more efficiently, and exploit new habitats. With Pangea's open landscapes, archosaurs spread quickly. Fossils from what is now Argentina, Africa, and North America all reveal early archosaurs that are nearly identical, showing how rapidly they conquered the supercontinent. This early expansion set the stage for the later dominance of dinosaurs, who would inherit a unified world ripe for exploration. But archosaurs weren't the only ones to benefit. Early mammal-like reptiles, the synapsids, were still widespread. While Dimetrodon and its kin eventually disappeared, their descendants gave rise to smaller, more adaptable creatures, furry insect eaters that would one day evolve into the first true mammals. In Pangea, the seeds of the future were scattered far and wide. Life on the move. One of the most fascinating aspects of Pangea's creatures was their ability to migrate. With no oceans cutting them off, animals could follow food, water, or climate shifts across staggering distances. Herds of herbivores may have wandered for thousands of miles, moving with the seasons, while predators followed close behind. Imagine standing on a high ridge and watching an endless procession of creatures, lumbering parasaurs, nimble reptiles, packs of early archosaurs, marching across the horizon like a living river. Even marine life was affected by Pangea's unity. With nearly all land fused together, Earth's oceans were essentially one vast water body, Panthalassa. For marine creatures, this meant global circulation patterns shaped their distribution, creating broad ecosystems that stretched across entire oceans. Coral reefs, sponge communities, and armored fish thrived in warm shallows along Pangea's coastlines, supporting a food web that sustained life both in the sea and on land. A world of opportunity and peril. Life on Pangea was full of opportunity, but it was also precarious. The lack of barriers meant diseases and parasites could spread more easily, affecting animals across the continent. Predators could roam farther, putting pressure on prey populations. And the extreme climates of Pangea's interior meant only the most resilient species survived. Nature thrives on challenge. The creatures of Pangea adapted in ingenious ways: sails for thermoregulation, armor for defense, wings for escape. The supercontinent was both a crucible and a playground, forcing life to innovate constantly. When dinosaurs finally appeared, they entered a world already shaped by millions of years of experimentation. They inherited the highways of Pangea, the ecosystems of swamp, desert, and forest, and the evolutionary momentum of archosaurs who had already spread across the land. Without Pangea's unity, dinosaurs might never have risen so quickly to global dominance. The living legacy, even today. The fossils of Pangea's creatures remind us of this borderless world. The same species found in South America and Africa prove that these lands were once connected. The Appalachians in North America and the Atlas Mountains in Morocco are twin scars of the same collision. In a way, every continent carries a memory of that time, fragments of a single, unified story etched in stone. The creatures of Pangea lived in a world of extremes, but also of possibilities. Their existence shows us how interconnected life can become when borders vanish, how species can spread, adapt, and transform when given a continent without barriers. For millions of years, Earth was truly one world, and its inhabitants were the explorers of a land without limits. But unity is never permanent. Beneath Pangea's surface, forces of unimaginable power were already stirring. The same tectonic engines that built this world without borders were quietly preparing to tear it apart. And when the cracks began to form, life would never be the same again. Chapter 4. The hidden cracks begin for millions of years. Pangea reigned as the greatest continent Earth had ever known. From pole to pole it stretched, an unbroken sweep of land bordered by endless ocean. Its interior held deserts larger than any that exist today. Its coasts bore forests, rivers, and swampy basins where early reptiles flourished. On its surface, life adapted to the extreme scorched summers, bitter winters, and vast distances that separated ecosystems. To the creatures roaming its plains and mountains, Pangea might have seemed eternal, solid, unshakable, but beneath its crust, deep within the restless mantle of the earth, change was already stirring. The story of Pangea's greatness is also the story of its fragility. For while it looked unbreakable from the surface, the truth is that Pangea was always temporary. Supercontinents form, they endure for tens of millions of years, and then, inevitably, they fracture. This is the rhythm of our planet, and Pangea was no exception. Its fate was sealed almost as soon as it was born. The cracks began invisibly, far beneath the surface. In the mantle, plumes of heat and molten rock welled upward from great depths. These mantle plumes acted like torches pressed against the base of the lithosphere, thinning and weakening it until the once solid crust began to stretch. In certain places, the land rose subtly, forming domes that bulged like slow blisters across the surface. These were the first signs, the hints that one day, the supercontinent would rupture. To the naked eye, nothing seemed unusual. The forests still spread across Pangea's margins, and rivers still cut through its mountains. The animals, primitive reptiles, amphibians, and early theropsids went about their lives as though the earth itself was not quietly plotting its next transformation. But the planet's surface is only a thin skin. Below it, pressures were building, pressures that would one day tear Pangea apart. Geologists today can trace these first hidden fractures through the rocks themselves. In places once joined by Pangea, we find matching fault lines, rift valleys, and volcanic deposits that tell of ancient stresses. Along what is now eastern North America, for example, the crust had begun to stretch, forming deep cracks that would later widen into the Atlantic Ocean. At the time, these were no more than scarce narrow valleys filled with lakes and wetlands, reminders that even continents can weaken and split. But it wasn't just the land that bore witness to these hidden forces. The climate, too, began to change. As the mantle plumes heated the crust, volcanic activity increased in scattered regions. Gases seeped into the atmosphere, subtly altering the balance of carbon dioxide. Shifts in global wind patterns reflected the slow reconfiguration of the planet's geography. For the life forms of the time, these changes were gradual, unfolding across spans of time far longer than any lifespan. Yet they were real, and they foreshadowed upheaval. To truly appreciate the scale of these early cracks, imagine standing on the shores of what would one day become the Atlantic. In the late Triassic period, around 230 million years ago, this coastline did not yet exist. Instead, you would see a broad plain stretching endlessly to the east, connecting what is now North America with Africa. The air was thick with humidity, the ground dotted with strange conifer-like trees and early cycads. Strange reptiles stalked the undergrowth, while giant insects buzzed in the damp air. At your feet, fissures ran through the earth, small, harmless-looking at first glance. But these fissures were the whispers of something immense, the first stage in the sundering of a supercontinent. As the rifting continued, long linear valleys formed. Rain and rivers filled them, creating chains of lakes bordered by steep cliffs. Volcanic eruptions occasionally tore through the surface, spilling basaltic lava and darkening the skies with ash. To the ancient animals, these must have seemed like localized disasters. To us, with hindsight, they are the telltale signs of continental breakup. These cracks were not isolated. They were the beginning of a system that would, over tens of millions of years, rip Pangea into separate continents and scatter them across the globe. One of the most remarkable aspects of this process is how silent it can appear when measured on human timescales. A continent does not simply snap in two. The stretching begins slowly, imperceptibly. Valleys widen by millimeters each year. Lava seeps from fissures, layer by layer building new crust. Entire ecosystems adapt to these subtle changes, migrating into the rift valleys, thriving in the lush vegetation that often springs up in fertile volcanic soils. Life continues almost unaware that the very ground beneath it is on the path to destruction. But even hidden, cracks can have dramatic consequences. Volcanism during the Triassic and Jurassic periods released enormous amounts of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. This warming climate transformed ecosystems, driving extinctions in some regions while allowing new groups to flourish in others. Dinosaurs, still relatively small and specialized at the time, found opportunities in these changing landscapes. By the Jurassic, they had begun their rise to dominance, aided in no small part by the environmental disruptions caused by Pangea's early fractures. The cracks were not confined to a single place. They spread in networks, radiating outward like lines in shattered glass. Along what is now South America and Africa, similar rifts appeared. In time, these would widen into the South Atlantic Ocean, elsewhere, in what would one day be India and Madagascar, or between Antarctica and Australia. The same stretching began. The great landmass that had once seemed eternal was in truth riddled with weaknesses. Geologists call these rifts failed arms when they do not progress to full separation. Many such failed rifts remain today, buried beneath layers of younger rock, silent witnesses to attempts by the Earth to tear itself apart. Others succeeded spectacularly, opening vast oceans that now separate continents by thousands of miles. Each crack, whether successful or failed, was part of the same hidden process, the slow dismemberment of Pangea. It is almost poetic, the way this cycle repeats. Continents collide, they unite, they rise into mountains, and then they fracture, scattering to the winds. The hidden cracks of Pangea remind us that nothing on Earth is permanent, not even land itself. What looks to us like the most solid, immovable part of the planet is, in truth, a shifting puzzle, endlessly rearranged by forces too deep and powerful for us to stop. By the mid-Jurassic, around 180 million years ago, the cracks had widened into undeniable rifts. The Atlantic Ocean began to open, narrow at first, then broader with each passing million years. What had once been a single supercontinent was now dividing into northern and southern halves, Laurasia in the north, Gondwana in the south. Eventually, even Gondwana itself would fragment further, giving rise to Africa, South America, Antarctica, India, and Australia. But all of that began here with the hidden cracks that spread silently through Pangea. For life on Earth, this breakup was both a challenge and an opportunity. New coastlines meant new habitats, shallow seas teeming with marine life, estuaries rich with nutrients. Dinosaurs diversified as ecosystems fractured, some adapting to forests, others to open plains. Early mammals, tiny and furtive, found niches where they could survive in the shadows. Plants spread along the rift valleys, taking advantage of the fertile volcanic soils. What might have seemed like destruction was also creation. The hidden cracks were rewriting the script of evolution, setting the stage for entirely new chapters of life. Today, the evidence of those cracks is everywhere, if you know where to look. The basins of eastern North America, places like the Connecticut River Valley, are remnants of those ancient rifts. The lava flows preserved in layers of basalt across multiple continents are the hardened blood of Earth's wounds. And the very shape of our modern world, the Atlantic Ocean stretching vast and blue between the Americas, Europe and Africa, is the ultimate legacy of those first fractures. The hidden cracks of Pangea were more than geological curiosities. They were the first whispers of change, the quiet heralds of a transformation that would scatter land and life across the globe. They remind us that permanence is an illusion, that the ground beneath us is never truly still. And they show us that even in destruction, there is creation, for without the breakup of Pangea, the Earth as we know it would not exist. The supercontinent's unity was always destined to end. The cracks had begun, and once they appeared, they could not be undone. Pangea's days as a single landmass were numbered. And with its slow unraveling, the stage was set for the rise of new oceans, new continents, and a new world. Chapter 5. The first rifts widen. Hidden cracks that had once whispered of change beneath Pangea were no longer secrets. They had begun to speak loudly, carving valleys, birthing volcanoes, and tugging at the land until the supercontinent itself started to shift. What was once a seamless expanse of rock and forest was now riddled with rift steers in the Earth's crust, where molten rock surged upward, where lakes formed and vanished, and where ecosystems were forever altered. The age of subtle warnings was over. The first rifts had widened, and with them came the beginning of the end for Pangea. To imagine this transformation, picture a vast plain stretching, unbroken to the horizon. One day, a fracture opens across the land. It may only spread a few meters at first, hardly enough to notice, but over centuries, it widens. Valleys deepen, their walls lined with jagged cliffs. Water rushes in, filling the cracks with long chains of lakes. Lava oozes from fissures, hardening into dark basalt. What began as a hairline fracture becomes a scar, then a wound, then an open gateway to the ocean itself. That is how continents are split, not with sudden violence, but with relentless persistence. Like a knife pressed deeper with each passing millennium, the first signs of widening rifts appeared along what is now the eastern edge of North America and the western fringe of Africa. Once joined as neighbors, these regions began to pull apart. Lakes pooled in the rift valleys, teeming with life. Early dinosaurs and other reptiles drank from their shores, leaving footprints in the mud that would fossilize and be discovered millions of years later. These rifts were not just scars of destruction. They were birthplaces of new worlds. Volcanic activity surged. Basaltic lava poured across the landscape, sometimes covering thousands of square miles in black stone. When the lava cooled, it created natural monuments, layered cliffs and plateaus that still rise today. In fact, some of the basalt seen in places like the Newark Basin in New Jersey or the coastlines of Morocco are remnants of those very eruptions. They are pieces of the story, frozen in rock. The widening rifts also reshaped the climate. Volcanic gases, especially carbon dioxide, poured into the atmosphere, pushing the planet into a warming phase. Rainfall patterns shifted as valleys opened and mountains collapsed. Monsoons grew stronger, flooding the rift basins, then drying into parched deserts. For the animals that lived through this time, survival meant adapting to rapid swings between plenty and scarcity. And here lies one of the great ironies of Pangea's breakup. What looked like destruction was also creation. Every rift valley became a cradle of life. The lakes that formed within them attracted fish, amphibians, and reptiles. Lush vegetation sprouted along the fertile soils. Insects swarmed. Predators prowled. For countless species, the widening cracks were not disasters but opportunities, places where life could flourish in the shadows of fire and stone. Dinosaurs in particular benefited from these shifts. By the late Triassic and early Jurassic, they had begun to grow larger, more diverse, more specialized. Their dominance of terrestrial ecosystems was accelerated by the environmental instability of the rifting world. As volcanic eruptions triggered extinctions among competing reptile groups, dinosaurs stepped into the void. What began as survival became dominance. Without the widening rifts, the age of dinosaurs might never have taken hold so firmly. But the rifts were not confined to one corner of Pangea. They spread like cracks in a frozen lake, radiating across the supercontinent. In what is now South America and Africa, the land began to stretch and thin. In time, this would become the South Atlantic Ocean, but for now it was still only valleys, lakes, and eruptions, an echo of the same process unfolding in the north. India and Madagascar, once joined tightly to Africa, began to edge away. Australia and Antarctica remained fused, but even there, stresses hinted at the future. What makes this moment in Earth's history so profound is its duality. On the one hand, the breakup of Pangea was a story of fire, chaos, and extinction. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history, erupted during this time, releasing enough lava to cover millions of square kilometers. The gases it released caused one of the great mass extinctions, wiping out nearly 80% of species at the end of the Triassic period. The world was reshaped, not only by the physical rifts, but by the ecological toll they exacted. On the other hand, the breakup created entirely new opportunities. New coastlines meant shallow seas rich in nutrients, fertile grounds for marine life. Estuaries formed where rivers met the young rift lakes. Coral reefs spread in warm waters. Dinosaurs thrived on land, while new species of fish, marine reptiles, and eventually early mammals found their own niches. The first rifts widened, and with them the tapestry of life grew more complex than ever before. To stand in that world would have been to witness a planet in flux. You might have heard the distant rumble of eruptions, seen ash clouds blotting the sky. You might have walked across a fertile floodplain one year and returned decades later to find it buried under hardened lava. Forests would vanish, only to regrow in the cracks left by cooling rock. Herds of reptiles and dinosaurs would follow the lake shores, migrating as waters rose and fell. This was not a world of stability, it was a world of constant change, where survival demanded flexibility. Geologists today read this story in the stones. The rift basins of North America, filled with sedimentary layers, preserve not only fossils, but records of ancient climates. Each band of rock tells of a season, a flood, a drought. Each fossilized footprint or ripple mark is a moment frozen in time, a reminder of life lived in the shadow of tectonic forces. The widening rifts left behind a diary written in basalt and sandstone, a record of Earth's greatest transformation. And as those rifts grew, the identity of the world itself began to shift. Pangea was no longer the single unbroken landmass it had once been. Its unity was fracturing. Laurasia drifted northward, Gondwana edged south, and in between, the first sliver of ocean began to form. It was narrow, shallow, almost inconsequential at first. But it was the beginning of the Atlantic Ocean, the great divide that would one day separate Europe from the Americas, Africa from the West. The first rifts were not just geological events. They were the birth cries of oceans, the blueprint for the world we inhabit today. The first rifts widened slowly, almost too slowly to notice millimeters per year. And yet, over millions of years, those millimeters became thousands of kilometers. Continents that had once been neighbors drifted apart until oceans rolled between them. The widening cracks were relentless. Nothing could stop them, because they were driven by the same forces that drive the Earth itself, the convective churn of the mantle, the restless energy of a living planet. Looking back, it's hard not to feel awe at the scale of this process. Imagine if you could stand in the same place across time, say, along the eastern seaboard of North America. At first, you'd see endless land stretching eastward, forests and plains running into the horizon. Millions of years later, the rifts would appear, filling with lakes. Later still, volcanic eruptions would blacken the sky. And finally, slowly but inevitably, the horizon itself would split, water would pour in, and what was once unbroken land would become a coastline overlooking an endless ocean. The first rifts widened, and in doing so, They redefined the very concept of Earth. The illusion of permanence shattered. Pangea, the mighty, the eternal, was revealed to be fleeting. Continents could move, split, and wander across the globe. Oceans could be born where there had been only stone. And life, endlessly adaptable, would continue to rise and fall with the shifting tides of geology. The cracks that began in secret had become undeniable. Pangea was breaking. And as the first rifts widened, a new world was being born, one that looked less like a single supercontinent and more like the Earth we know today. Chapter 6. Oceans on the horizon. The first cracks had spread. The rift valleys had deepened. Lava had flowed in thick black sheets across the land, and lakes had gathered in basins carved by the tug-of-war of the Earth's crust. Now something even more dramatic was on the horizon, the birth of entire oceans. For millions of years, Pangea had been surrounded by a single, vast body of water, the Pangea Ocean. It wrapped around the globe like an endless blue desert, punctuated only by the smaller Tethys Sea tucked into the supercontinent's eastern edge. But with rifts now widening across the land, Pangea was no longer enough. Water, drawn by gravity and opportunity, began to pour into the great fractures that split the supercontinent. This was the moment when the Earth shifted from one ocean to many, from unity to separation. The world was learning a new rhythm. Picture the scene. A rift valley stretches for hundreds of miles, flanked by cliffs and mountains. At its floor lies a series of lakes shimmering in the sun. Rivers feed them, and in their waters swim early fish, amphibians, and crocodile-like reptiles. Over time, the valley widens. The cliffs on either side are pulled farther apart, and the ground between them sinks. Rainfall alone can no longer keep up with the growing emptiness. Slowly, inevitably, seawater begins to creep in. At first it arrives in trickles, then in torrents, until the valley is no longer a string of lakes but a long, narrow arm of the ocean. This is how oceans are born, quietly, gradually, but with consequences that span the ages. The Atlantic Ocean, now the second largest body of water on Earth, had its origins in such a rift. What began as a fracture between North America and Africa grew wider year by year, until by the Jurassic period, a shallow sea stretched between them. It was not yet the vast expanse we know today, but a proto-Atlantic, a young ocean in the making. To the creatures that lived along its shores, this was nothing short of transformation. Where once there had been endless inland plains, there were now coastlines. Salt water mixed with fresh water, creating estuaries rich in nutrients. Tidal zones formed, supporting new communities of life. Shallow seas became nurseries for fish and marine reptiles, offering food and shelter in abundance. Entire ecosystems arose that could never have existed in the closed, continental world of early Pangea. And as oceans crept inland, they carried with them a new sense of movement. The supercontinent that had once acted as a barrier was now breaking apart, opening corridors for marine life to spread and evolve. The isolation that had once limited diversity began to dissolve. Just as land animals had once roamed freely across Pangea's unbroken stretches, now ocean creatures could move into new basins, exploring worlds that had never existed before. But the story of oceans on the horizon is not just one of opportunity. It is also a story of upheaval. The very forces that created these seas were destructive, violent, and often catastrophic. As rifts opened, they unleashed vast volcanic eruptions. Entire provinces of basalt poured from fissures, blanketing regions in black rock. The Central Atlantic Magmatic Province, formed during this time, remains one of the largest volcanic events in Earth's history. The gases it released, carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and methane, altered the climate on a planetary scale. Temperatures rose, ecosystems faltered, and many species perished in a mass extinction at the end of the Triassic. The widening oceans were born in fire, and life paid the price. Yet from this destruction came resilience. Dinosaurs, already on the rise, weathered the storms and thrived in the aftermath. Their adaptability, their ability to exploit different habitats, gave them an edge in a world reshaped by rifts and oceans. Where other reptiles vanished, dinosaurs grew larger, faster, and more diverse. Without the environmental chaos triggered by the formation of new oceans, they might never have risen to the dominance that would define the Jurassic and Cretaceous periods. The birth of oceans also reshaped climates in ways both subtle and profound. Pangea's vast interior had been arid, scorched by heat, and deprived of rainfall. But as rifts filled with seawater, coastlines expanded. Moisture from the seas created new weather patterns, bringing rain to once parched regions. Forests returned in places where deserts had dominated. Monsoons shifted, carrying life-giving water into valleys that had known only drought. The Earth was rediscovering balance, trading the extremes of supercontinental life for the moderating influence of oceans. From a geological perspective, the opening of new oceans is like watching the Earth breathe. The crust stretches, cracks, and sinks, and the mantle responds by creating new seafloor. Lava rises, cools, and hardens into fresh oceanic crust, pushing the landmasses farther apart. Even today, the Atlantic Ocean continues to widen by about an inch each year, driven by the same mid-ocean ridge system that began in the age of Pangea. In this sense, the horizon we see today, the Atlantic's rolling waves, its deep blue expanse is still the continuation of that ancient process. To stand at the edge of one of these first oceans would have been to witness a world in flux. Imagine a coastline where waves lap at cliffs of basalt, still warm from eruption centuries earlier. Dense forests press close to the shore, their roots reaching for the water. Pterosaurs wheel overhead, diving into the shallows for fish. Early marine reptiles, ancestors of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs, hunt in the surf. This was not merely a new landscape. It was a new world, one where land and sea met in ways that had never existed before. The oceans on the horizon also carried symbolic weight. They marked the end of Pangea's illusion of permanence. The mighty supercontinent, which had once seemed indestructible, was being undone by forces deep within the earth. Its unity was dissolving, its edges fraying, its heart torn open by seas that crept into its wounds. Each new coastline was a reminder that nothing lasts forever, not even continents. And yet, from the perspective of life, these oceans were gifts. They expanded the range of habitats, opened new evolutionary pathways, and set the stage for the future diversity of the planet. The fish that swam in these early seas would one day give rise to lineages that dominate the oceans today. The reptiles that hunted in their waters foreshadowed the great marine predators of the Mesozoic. Even tiny plankton, flourishing in the nutrient-rich shallows, began to shape Earth's climate by pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and locking it away in limestone on the seafloor. The Earth was rewriting itself. Oceans, once confined to the edges of the globe, were now carving into its very heart. The horizon no longer stretched endlessly over land. It shimmered with waves, tides, and salt spray. A new world was coming into focus, one that looked more and more like the Earth we recognize today. The story of Pangea's breakup is, at its core, the story of transformation. From cracks to rifts, from rifts to oceans, from destruction to creation, the planet moved forward in its endless cycle of change. The oceans on the horizon were more than just water. They were the future, the promise of a planet that would continue to evolve, adapt, and surprise. Pangea was breaking apart. The first seas had opened. And with each widening gulf, the Earth edged closer to the world we now call home. Chapter 7, Mountains from Chaos. The breakup of Pangea was not only a story of oceans carving their way into the land. It was also a story of mountains' vast ranges that rose from the violence of splitting continents. From chaos came peaks, ridges, and highlands, landscapes as dramatic as the oceans they paralleled. If the seas reshaped the low places of Earth, Then mountains told the story of the high places, born in fire, pressure, and unimaginable force. When people think of mountains, they often imagine slow, stately growth, an ancient process unfolding quietly over millions of years. And in a way, that is true. But the forces that forged mountains from the breakup of Pangea were anything but quiet. They were explosive, violent, and transformative. Entire swaths of rock buckled and folded. Plates collided at impossible speeds by geological standards, creating ranges that dwarfed anything human. History had yet seen to understand these mountains. You must imagine Pangea not as a single, still continent, but as a restless beast. Beneath its surface, heat churned in the mantle, rising like water in a boiling pot. This heat pushed at the crust, cracking it, splitting it, driving pieces of land away from one another. But where one plate moved away, another often slammed into its neighbor. The result was chaos. Places where continents tore apart gave birth to valleys and seas, while places where continents collided gave birth to mountains. It was a world caught between destruction and creation. One of the most dramatic results of this chaos was the formation of mountain belts along the edges of the new Atlantic Ocean. As North America pulled away from Africa and Europe, their margins tore and fractured, creating long fault zones. In some regions, these faults lifted rock upward, forming rugged ranges that overlooked the newborn ocean. To early life, these were massive barriers reshaping climates and ecosystems. To us, they are the ghostly ancestors of mountain ranges we still see today. But it wasn't just the Atlantic that saw upheaval. Far to the west, as plates shifted, entire arcs of mountains began to rise where ancient oceans closed. The collision zones around the Pacific and the Tethys Seas generated mountain chains through compression and subduction. These processes were messy, chaotic, and relentless. Whole slabs of oceanic crust were forced beneath continental plates, crumpling rock, melting it into magma, and thrusting it back to the surface in fiery eruptions. From these fiery margins, new mountains clawed their way into the sky. Picture the landscape, towering ridges where once there had been flat plains, their slopes blackened with lava and streaked with rivers of ash. Volcanoes rose like giants, some erupting so violently that they blotted out the sun. These eruptions spread basalt across vast plateaus, building layer upon layer of rock that hardened into rugged highlands. For creatures that had once roamed a unified, flat Pangea, the sudden appearance of these mountains was disorienting. Herds of dinosaurs found their migration routes blocked. Forests that had stretched for hundreds of miles were now hemmed in by peaks and valleys. The world had become more fragmented, more vertical, more challenging, and yet, just as oceans created new opportunities, so too did mountains. Their slopes trapped moisture from the air, creating rain shadows on one side and lush, wet forests on the other. Rivers carved valleys that teemed with life. Lava flows cooled into nutrient-rich soils, encouraging plants to grow in abundance. The very chaos that birthed the mountains also seeded new ecosystems. Each adapted to its place in this fractured landscape. One of the most fascinating aspects of this time was how mountains interacted with climate. As Pangea broke apart, its interior deserts began to shrink, replaced by forests and fertile valleys. Mountains accelerated this shift. They redirected winds, altered rainfall patterns, and even influenced global temperatures by exposing vast amounts of fresh rock that absorbed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. In this way, mountains helped stabilize a climate that had been destabilized by the breakup itself. They were both scars of destruction and agents of renewal. But the story of mountains, from chaos, was not limited to volcanoes and fault zones. In some regions, continents collided in ways that produced long, sprawling ranges, the kind we associate with great mountain systems today. Imagine two massive slabs of land pressing into each other with the force of an entire planet's weight. Neither gives way. Instead, the crust buckles upward, folding and crumpling into peaks that stretch for hundreds of miles. This was how ranges like the early ancestors of the Appalachians and the Atlas were, shaped remnants of Pangea's earlier collisions that were reawakened by its breakup. The Appalachians, in particular, tell a story of cycles. They had first been raised hundreds of millions of years earlier, when the pieces of Pangea came together. Now as Pangea tore apart, they were reshaped once more, uplifted and fractured. Though time has since worn them down into rolling hills, in their prime they would have rivaled the Himalayas. Standing atop them in the age of Pangea's breakup would have been to look out over a fractured earth, mountains marching into the horizon like the spines of a great beast. And consider the creatures that adapted to these changes. Dinosaurs that had once thrived in flat, arid environments now explored forests along mountain slopes. Smaller species found refuge in valleys, where streams provided water year-round. Flying reptiles soared on updrafts created by steep cliffs, while early mammals sought shelter in caves formed from volcanic rock. Even insects diversified, spreading into new niches created by the patchwork of ecosystems that mountains imposed. Life was responding to chaos with creativity. From a human perspective, mountains are often symbols of permanence, of majesty, of obstacles to overcome. But in the story of Pangea, they symbolize something deeper, the relentless energy of Earth, the truth that even destruction can give rise to creation. Without the chaos of splitting continents, without the violence of colliding plates, many of the mountain ranges we know today would never have existed. Nor would the ecosystems that flourished in their shadow. Imagine walking through this world. A valley floor where rivers braid together, their waters fed by glaciers high above. Forests of conifers and cycads stretch along the slopes, their trunks shrouded in mist. In the distance, a volcano rumbles, its peak glowing red against the night sky. The ground trembles with each eruption, yet life clings to the land, growing, adapting, evolving. It is a world of instability, but also of resilience, a world defined by mountains from chaos. These mountains, born from destruction, would shape the Earth's destiny. They would guide rivers that carved the land. They would influence climates for millions of years. They would stand as monuments to the breakup of Pangea, reminders that even in the most violent upheaval, there is the potential for renewal. In the end, the story of mountains is the story of balance. Oceans opened the world, but mountains divided it. Together, they created a planet of contrasts, wet and dry, high and low, fertile and barren. This contrast is what gave Earth its richness, its diversity, its ability to host life in forms as varied as dinosaurs, mammals, and eventually us. Pangea was breaking apart, but from its chaos rose peaks that touched the sky. Mountains, once born of destruction, would stand as guardians of a new Earth, watchtowers over a planet that was learning how to be more than one land, more than one ocean, more than one story. Chapter 8. The climate turns. When Pangea began to crack, it wasn't only the land that changed. The air itself, the winds, the rains, the very breath of the planet shifted in ways that transformed life forever. The breakup of a supercontinent wasn't simply a geological story. It was a climatic revolution. For millions of years, while Pangea stood whole, the interior of that immense landmass had been a hostile desert. Imagine being hundreds, even thousands of miles from the nearest sea. Moisture rarely reached that far inland, and without rain, plants struggled to survive. Much of central Pangea was barren, a vast expanse of dunes and salt flats stretching under a scorching sun. Only along the coasts and rivers did forests cling to the land. In that desert heart, survival was brutal. Dinosaurs adapted to heat and drought, wandered across cracked earth in search of water, while early mammals hid in burrows, waiting for nightfall to cool the air. But then, the cracks began to widen. Oceans, those great engines of climate, pushed their way into the land. The Atlantic was still young then, a growing scar between North America and Africa. But already it was reshaping the weather. Where dry winds had once swept across endless sand, now moisture began to ride the breezes inland. Rain returned to regions that had been bone dry for tens of millions of years. The climate was turning. The shift was not instant. It was a slow, almost imperceptible transformation, so gradual that no single creature could have noticed. But over millions of years, deserts shrank. Grasslands and forests crept across valleys. Rivers grew stronger, carving channels that filled with life. The once harsh, parched interior of Pangea began to green dot, and with water came abundance. Plants flourished, spreading across the landscape in lush carpets of cycads, ferns, and towering conifers. Insects multiplied in staggering numbers, feeding off the vegetation. Dinosaurs, once forced to migrate great distances in search of sustenance, now found food at their feet. Herbivores grazed in herds, their populations swelling in response to the sudden wealth of greenery. Carnivores followed, thriving on the bounty of prey. The earth had shifted from scarcity to plenty, and life responded with explosion. But this was not simply a story of deserts vanishing. It was also a story of extremes. As mountains rose and seas spread, climates fractured into regions more diverse than anything Pangea had seen before. The monsoons, seasonal rains driven by heat and ocean moisture, grew more powerful. Entire regions swung between wet and dry with staggering force. In some places, floods swept away everything in their path, only to be followed by long months of drought. To survive here meant adapting not to one climate, but to many. Some creatures thrived in this chaos. Amphibians and reptiles took advantage of the wet seasons to breed in temporary lakes. Plants developed strategies to endure droughts, storing water in thick stems or dropping seeds that could wait in the soil until rain returned. Dinosaurs evolved new behaviors. Herds moved with the rhythms of the monsoon, and predators learned to track them across changing landscapes. What once had been static, a desert locked in place, was now dynamic, alive with constant change. The cooling and warming patterns that accompanied the breakup also shaped the poles. Before, Pangea's sheer size had created climates that were extreme but predictable: hot interiors, cooler coasts. But as the landmass fractured, currents began to flow differently, redistributing heat across the planet. The poles, once relatively temperate, began to see sharper seasonal shifts. Winters grew colder, summers warmer. Forests adapted, and with them the creatures that lived beneath their canopies. Even in high latitudes, life found ways to flourish, with dinosaurs sporting insulating feathers and plants evolving to withstand frost at the same time. Carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere rose and fell in response to the changing Earth. Volcanic eruptions released massive amounts of greenhouse gases, warming the planet. Yet newly exposed mountain ranges and fresh rock from rifting continents drew that carbon back down, cooling the climate in the long term. The result was a planet caught between extremes, constantly teetering between sweltering heat and refreshing cool. Life had to remain flexible, adjusting to shifts that could transform ecosystems over just a few million years, a blink in geological time. And all of this, astonishingly, was interconnected. Oceans carved into continents, mountains redirected winds, volcanic eruptions clouded the skies. A crack in the Earth's crust on one side of the world could trigger a cascade of changes felt thousands of miles away. This was a climate in flux, driven by the restless heartbeat of tectonics. From a human point of view, these changes remind us of just how fragile climate balance can be. Today, we often imagine climate as something stable: 4 seasons, predictable cycles, reliable patterns. But in the age of Pangea's breakup, climate was anything but steady. It was a world of extremes, of deserts transforming into forests, of monsoons reshaping landscapes year after year, of poles swinging between warmth and cold. To live then was to adapt or vanish. The evidence of this turning climate can still be read in rocks today. Sedimentary layers tell the story. Bands of red sandstone formed in deserts, capped by layers of shale that speak of wetlands and lakes. Fossilized plants mark the return of rain, showing how forests marched into once barren regions. Coal deposits hint at swamps that thrived where none had existed before. In every rock and every fossil, the record of a climate in transition is written like chapters in a book. And yet, despite its chaos, this new climate carried the seeds of the world we know today. The breakup of Pangea set in motion the circulation of oceans and winds that continue to shape modern weather patterns. The monsoons that sweep across Asia today, the trade winds that carry storms across the Atlantic, the deserts of Africa and the rainforest of South America all trace their origins to this turning point in Earth's history. The climate turned then, and in doing so, it set the stage for the future. So, as mountains clawed upward and seas sliced into the land, the air itself shifted. The deserts of Pangea died, forests spread, and rains returned. A barren world gave way to one bursting with life. The climate turned, and with it, the destiny of the planet. Chapter 9. Life torn apart. Species. The breakup of Pangea was not just a geological event. It was a biological upheaval, a shattering of ecosystems that had been united for millions of years. When the great supercontinent split, it didn't only fracture the land. It fractured life itself. For tens of millions of years, Pangea had been a connected world. Dinosaurs, reptiles, amphibians, and early mammals could travel across vast distances without encountering an ocean to stop them. From the northern forests to the southern deserts, species spread and mingled, their ranges stretching across continents. Fossils from the Triassic and early Jurassic tell this story vividly. The same species found in North America also appeared in Europe, Africa, and even Asia. It was a global stage, with actors roaming freely across it. But when the cracks began to widen, everything changed. Oceans are barriers of life. They divide, isolate, and separate species that once shared the same ground. As the Atlantic slowly opened, North America was pulled away from Africa. South America drifted west. India tore free and began its lonely voyage across the Tethys Sea. Australia would eventually follow its own path into isolation. Each fragment of Pangea carried with it a community of life cut off, stranded, forced to adapt in isolation. This isolation is one of evolution's greatest engines. When populations are split, they can no longer exchange genes. Over millions of years, differences build. Traits diverge. Species once united become strangers to one another. This is the birth of biodiversity born from the pain of separation. The breakup of Pangea was a tragedy for some species, but for others, it was an opportunity. It was the moment when life's tree exploded with new branches. Take the dinosaurs, for example. During Pangea's prime, many groups spread far and wide. But once the continents drifted apart, they began to evolve in different directions. In what is now South America, giant sauropods flourished, some growing to sizes never before seen on Earth. Animals like Argentinosaurus, stretching over 100 feet long. In North America, different lineages took shape, giving rise to creatures like Allosaurus and later the mighty Tyrannosaurus. In Asia, armored dinosaurs and unique feathered predators appeared, shaping ecosystems that were unlike any on other continents. It wasn't just dinosaurs. Early mammals, tiny and overshadowed in Pangea, also began to diversify. In some regions, they became specialized insect eaters. In others, they adapted to climb, burrow, or glide. Their fates were shaped by the lands they were trapped on, creating evolutionary experiments that would one day pave the way for primates, elephants, whales, and us. Even plants were torn apart by this great division. Forests that once stretched unbroken across continents now became isolated pockets. In South America, flowering plants began to dominate earlier than in some other regions, while in Africa, ancient lineages of cycads and conifers persisted. These differences still echo today in the unique plant life of each continent. But while isolation drove diversity, it also drove extinction. Some species simply could not adapt to the new climates and barriers. Animals that relied on long migrations found their roots cut off by seas. Coastal creatures were drowned by rising waters. Deserts expanded in some regions, wiping out fragile ecosystems. And then there were the volcanoes. Massive eruptions poured carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere, triggering climate shifts that pushed many species past their breaking point. Whole lineages vanished forever, their fossils the only trace they ever lived. It was not only the giants that struggled. Small creatures too felt the consequences of a divided world. Insects that once pollinated across continents now had to adapt to specific plants in isolated regions. Amphibians that relied on stable freshwater systems were devastated when rivers shifted or dried. Fish populations were trapped in newly formed lakes, evolving into species found nowhere else on Earth. This was life torn apart, life forced to change or perish. And yet, through this chaos, life's resilience shone. Evolution thrives on challenge, and the breakup of Pangea created challenges on a global scale. Where deserts formed, desert specialists evolved. Where mountains rose, species adapted to high altitudes. Where seas divided, new predators and prey filled the gaps. The ecosystems of today, the Amazon rainforest, the African savannas, the Australian outback, can all trace their origins back to this age of fragmentation. Perhaps most striking of all, this period taught life a new lesson. Adaptability is survival. The creatures that endured were not always the biggest or strongest, but those that could bend with the changing earth. Early birds, small mammals, and diverse reptiles all found ways to thrive in niches that larger, less flexible species could not. This quiet adaptability would one day allow mammals, once insignificant under the feet of dinosaurs, to inherit the earth. For paleontologists, the evidence of this story is written in stone. Fossils that were once identical across continents diverged sharply after the breakup. In South America, you find one set of dinosaurs. In Africa, another. In Australia, entire lineages of marsupials flourish, while elsewhere they vanish. It is as though a once unified cast of characters suddenly splintered, each telling their own story on their own stage. Standing back, the picture becomes clear. The breakup of Pangea tore life apart, but in doing so, it created the incredible diversity of species we see today. Without that separation, there would be no kangaroos unique to Australia, no giraffes unique to Africa, no hummingbirds unique to the Americas. The loss of connection was painful, but it was also the beginning of uniqueness. Life, torn apart, found ways to write new stories. Stories of survival, of adaptation, of creativity born from isolation. The earth was no longer one world. It was many, and each would nurture its own wonders. Chapter 9: Life Torn Apart. Species. The breakup of Pangea was not just a geological event. It was a biological upheaval, a shattering of ecosystems that had been united for millions of years. When the great supercontinent split, it didn't only fracture the land. It fractured life itself. For tens of millions of years, Pangea had been a connected world. Dinosaurs, reptiles, amphibians, and early mammals could travel across vast distances without encountering an ocean to stop them. From the northern forests to the southern deserts, species spread and mingled, their ranges stretching across continents. Fossils from the Triassic and early Jurassic tell this story vividly. The same species found in North America also appeared in Europe, Africa, and even Asia. It was a global stage, with actors roaming freely across it. But when the cracks began to widen, everything changed. Oceans are barriers of life. They divide, isolate, and separate species that once shared the same ground. As the Atlantic slowly opened, North America was pulled away from Africa. South America drifted west. India tore free and began its lonely voyage across the Tethys Sea. Australia would eventually follow its own path into isolation. Each fragment of Pangea carried with it a community of life cut off, stranded, forced to adapt in isolation. This isolation is one of evolution's greatest engines. When populations are split, they can no longer exchange genes. Over millions of years, differences build. Traits diverge. Species once united become strangers to one another. This is the birth of biodiversity born from the pain of separation. The breakup of Pangea was a tragedy for some species, but for others, it was an opportunity. It was the moment when life's tree exploded with new branches. Take the dinosaurs, for example. During Pangea's prime, many groups spread far and wide. But once the continents drifted apart, they began to evolve in different directions. In what is now South America, giant sauropods flourished, some growing to sizes never before seen on Earth. Animals like Argentinosaurus, stretching over 100 feet long. In North America, different lineages took shape, giving rise to creatures like Allosaurus and later the mighty Tyrannosaurus. In Asia, armored dinosaurs and unique feathered predators appeared, shaping ecosystems that were unlike any on other continents. It wasn't just dinosaurs. Early mammals, tiny and overshadowed in Pangea, also began to diversify. In some regions, they became specialized insect eaters. In others, they adapted to climb, burrow, or glide. Their fates were shaped by the lands they were trapped on, creating evolutionary experiments that would one day pave the way for primates, elephants, whales, and us. Even plants were torn apart by this great division. Forests that once stretched unbroken across continents now became isolated pockets. In South America, flowering plants began to dominate earlier than in some other regions, while in Africa, ancient lineages of cycads and conifers persisted. These differences still echo today in the unique plant life of each continent. But while isolation drove diversity, it also drove extinction. Some species simply could not adapt to the new climates and barriers. Animals that relied on long migrations found their routes cut off by seas. Coastal creatures were drowned by rising waters. Deserts expanded in some regions, wiping out fragile ecosystems. And then there were the volcanoes. Massive eruptions poured carbon dioxide and sulfur into the atmosphere, triggering climate shifts that pushed many species past their breaking point. Whole lineages vanished forever, their fossils the only trace they ever lived. It was not only the giants that struggled. Small creatures too felt the consequences of a divided world. Insects that once pollinated across continents now had to adapt to specific plants in isolated regions. Amphibians that relied on stable freshwater systems were devastated when rivers shifted or dried. Fish populations were trapped in newly formed lakes, evolving into species found nowhere else on Earth. This was life torn apart, life forced to change or perish. And yet, through this chaos, life's resilience shone. Evolution thrives on challenge, and the breakup of Pangea created challenges on a global scale. Where deserts formed, desert specialists evolved. Where mountains rose, species adapted to high altitudes. Where seas divided, new predators and prey filled the gaps. The ecosystems of today, the Amazon rainforest, the African savannas, the Australian outback, can all trace their origins back to this age of fragmentation. Perhaps most striking of all, this period taught life a new lesson. Adaptability is survival. The creatures that endured were not always the biggest or strongest, but those that could bend with the changing earth. Early birds, small mammals, and diverse reptiles all found ways to thrive in niches that larger, less flexible species could not. This quiet adaptability would one day allow mammals, once insignificant under the feet of dinosaurs, to inherit the earth. For paleontologists, the evidence of this story is written in stone. Fossils that were once identical across continents diverged sharply after the breakup. In South America, you find one set of dinosaurs. In Africa, Another. In Australia, entire lineages of marsupials flourish, while elsewhere they vanish. It is as though a once unified cast of characters suddenly splintered, each telling their own story on their own stage. Standing back, the picture becomes clear. The breakup of Pangea tore life apart, but in doing so, it created the incredible diversity of species we see today. Without that separation, there would be no kangaroos unique to Australia, no giraffes unique to Africa, no hummingbirds unique to the Americas. The loss of connection was painful, but it was also the beginning of uniqueness. Life, torn apart, found ways to write new stories. Stories of survival, of adaptation, of creativity born from isolation. The Earth was no longer one world. It was many, and each would nurture its own wonders. Chapter 10. The Atlantic awakens. At first, it was only a crack, somewhere between what we now call North America and Africa. Deep within the crust of Pangea, pressure built. Magma surged upward, pushing, straining, weakening the rock above. Over millions of years, the land buckled and split. A rift valley formed, stretching like a scar across the supercontinent. To the creatures walking its edges, it may have seemed like little more than a line of volcanoes, steaming vents and shifting ground. But in truth, this was the birth cry of an ocean, the Atlantic Ocean. The Atlantic did not roar into existence overnight. It was a slow awakening, a widening yawn of the Earth itself. At first, the rift was a narrow basin, filling with water from rivers and seas. Lakes formed, long and narrow, much like the Great Rift Valley lakes of Africa today. Volcanic eruptions painted the ground black with basalt, creating fresh crust where none had existed before. This was the process of seafloor spreading, the constant pulling apart of Earth's plates, with new oceanic crust rising from below to fill the gap. The Atlantic had opened its eyes. As the rift grew, the waters of the ancient Tethys Sea and Panthalassa began to seep in. The lakes became seas, and the seas became a widening ocean. Slowly, inexorably, the two continents, North America and Africa, drifted farther apart. Each year, the gap widened by mere centimeters, but over millions of years, those centimeters added up to thousands of miles. The Atlantic Ocean, so vast today it takes hours to cross by plane, was once narrow enough to walk around in weeks. And as it grew, it transformed the world. Oceans are more than water. They are engines of climate, life, and movement. The young Atlantic began to shape winds and rainfall, bringing new weather to lands once locked in desert. Moisture spread inland, greening regions that had once been barren. Monsoons intensified along its shores, carving new cycles of flood and drought. The ocean was not just a boundary, it was a climate maker. Life, too, responded with astonishing speed. As coastlines formed, shallow seas spread across continental margins. These were warm, sunlit waters, perfect nurseries for new species. Coral reefs flourished, building elaborate cities of stone beneath the waves. Mollusks, ammonites, and early fish explored these rich ecosystems. Reptiles followed, with marine giants like ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs cruising the Atlantic shallows, hunting in the teeming waters. What had once been barren land was now alive with the rhythms of the sea. But the Atlantic was not a gentle newborn. It was violent, restless, and full of fire. Along its length, a chain of volcanoes erupted, building what we now know as the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Lava poured forth in sheets, hardening into new crust. Earthquakes rattled the seafloor as the plates shifted and tore. The Atlantic was a place of constant creation, a seam in the planet that never slept. Even today, this ridge is the beating heart of the ocean, stretching like a scar from the Arctic to the Southern Ocean. For the continents it divided, the Atlantic was destiny. North America, once bound to Africa, now drifted westward. South America followed, carrying with it a cargo of life that would evolve in splendid isolation. To the east, Africa and Europe stood their ground, tied to the legacy of Gondwana. Each movement, each inch of separation, was another step in shaping the continents we know today. Without the Atlantic, there would be no Americas as we understand them, no Caribbean islands, no Amazon rainforest, no Rocky Mountains. The ocean gave birth not only to itself, but to the map of our modern world. The Atlantic also carried with it another force: currents. As the ocean widened, water began to circulate, driven by winds and the pull of Earth's rotation. These currents linked ecosystems across vast distances. They carried nutrients from one shore to another, feeding plankton blooms that in turn fed fish, reptiles, and eventually birds. The Atlantic was not just a divider, it was a connector, a highway for life. To stand on the shores of this newborn ocean, millions of years ago, would have been to witness something almost unimaginable. Imagine walking across what is now Morocco or Nova Scotia, watching the land tremble beneath your feet. Volcanic fountains light up the horizon, spilling rivers of fire into the growing basin. To the west, water pools and valleys, stretching farther every year. To the east, the land itself seems to drift away, as if the earth is tearing in slow motion. And above it all, great reptiles soar on the wind, their shadows flickering across a landscape caught between destruction and creation. The awakening of the Atlantic was not without consequence. Volcanic outpourings released vast amounts of carbon dioxide, heating the planet. At times, this warming triggered crises, mass die-offs in the oceans, disruptions of ecosystems on land. Some scientists believe that one of the great extinction events of the Jurassic period was linked to volcanic activity tied to the Atlantic's birth. Life always rebounded, but never without loss. The price of a new ocean was often pagan species. Yet out of this turmoil came opportunity. The Atlantic opened new coastlines, and with them, new habitats. Shallow seas became cradles of evolution, where species experimented with form and function. Some reptiles returned fully to the water, becoming streamlined swimmers. Plants adapted to salty shores, clinging to the edges of the land. Insects followed, pollinating flowers that spread across fertile coastal plains. The breakup of Pangea had torn life apart, but the Atlantic gave it new places to begin again. Today, we take the Atlantic for granted, a vast blue expanse that separates continents. But in truth, it is still young, still growing, still awakening. Every year, it widens by a few centimeters more, the echo of that first crack in Pangea still rippling outward. The mid-Atlantic ridge continues to rise, volcanoes continue to erupt, and the continents continue their slow drift apart. To study the Atlantic is to study a living process, one that began 200 million years ago and is still unfolding beneath our feet. The day Pangea cracked, the Atlantic began its long awakening. And with it, the Earth was forever transformed. A supercontinent gave way to a superocean, and the world as we know it, its climates, its species, its very geography was born. Chapter 11. Dinosaurs divided for millions of years. Dinosaurs thrived on the unity of Pangea. The supercontinent had given them a world without borders. Herds could migrate across entire hemispheres. Predators could roam vast hunting grounds, and species mixed and mingled in ways no ecosystem could replicate today. From the deserts at the equator to the forests of the poles, dinosaurs lived in a single interconnected stage, one colossal theater of life. But when Pangea cracked, when mountains rose and oceans bled into the land, this stage was cut to pieces. And with it, the reign of dinosaurs entered a new and divided era. The split of Pangea was not only a geological event, it was an evolutionary one. For the first time, dinosaurs found themselves isolated on drifting continents, unable to cross the widening seas. Populations that had once interbred were now separated by entire oceans. A predator in what would become Africa would never again meet its cousin in South America. A plant-eating herd in North America would never again graze the same plains as one in Europe. The world of dinosaurs fractured, and so did their story. At first, the separation was subtle. In the early Jurassic, the continents had only begun to drift apart, and some species still looked remarkably similar across different lands. But as millions of years passed, isolation did what it always does. It shaped new forms out in the west, across what would one day become South America and Argentina. Giant long-necked sauropods stretched to astonishing sizes. Creatures like Argentinosaurus would eventually grow to more than 100 feet long, pushing the limits of life on land. Their sheer size was an answer to wide-open plains and lush vegetation, a strategy of bulk survival. Meanwhile, in Africa, different sauropods took over, with species like Paralititan adapting to swampy deltas and coastal forests. Both were giants, but they evolved apart, their paths shaped by the landscapes of their drifting homes. Predators, too, changed under the weight of separation. In North America, allosaurids reigned supreme, fast and efficient hunters with massive jaws. But across the Atlantic, in Africa, another lineage rose, the carcharodontos with teeth shaped like shark blades. They became the dominant killers of Gondwana, evolving into monsters like Carcharodontosaurus and Giganotosaurus, rivals in size to the famous Tyrannosaurus that would appear much later in the north. And then there was Spinosaurus, a predator unlike any other, ruling the river systems of Africa. Its crocodile-like snout, towering sail, and semi-aquatic lifestyle were answers to a world rich with fish-filled rivers and coastal swamps. Nothing like it evolved in North America, where the land was drier, the rivers smaller. Here, evolution had gone in a completely different direction. This was the power of division. Oceans did not just separate dinosaurs, they rewrote their destiny. Herbivores followed the same path. In Asia, hadrosaurs, duck-billed dinosaurs, would one day rise, spreading into countless forms, from crested species like Parasaurolophus to massive herds of Edmontosaurus. In South America, their absence allowed other plant eaters, like the armored ankylosaurs and horned ceratopsians, to dominate. Each continent wrote its own script, its own cast of characters, because the ocean had cut the lines of communication. But the division went deeper than just shape and size. It shaped entire ecosystems. In Gondwana, giant predators coexisted in ways impossible elsewhere. Africa's rivers might host both Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus, massive carnivores that somehow shared the land by splitting their diets, one ruling the water, the other the land. Meanwhile, in North America, ecosystems tended to crown one apex predator at a time, from Allosaurus in the Jurassic to Tyrannosaurus in the late Cretaceous. The continents, divided, developed their own ecological rules. Isolation also made some dinosaurs stranger than ever before. In Madagascar, cut off early from both Africa and India, bizarre species evolved in splendid solitude. The theropod Majungasaurus, for instance, became a short-snouted, bone-crushing predator, even rumored to have practiced cannibalism. In Australia, separated at the far southern edge, plant eaters like Muttaburrasaurus took on unfamiliar forms. Adapted to polar winters where darkness reigned for months. It is one of the great ironies of history. The breakup of Pangea may have weakened dinosaurs as a unified force, but it also made them more diverse than ever. With each continent acting as a separate evolutionary laboratory, life experimented wildly. Horns curved into elaborate shapes, armor grew heavier, necks stretched longer, sails rose higher. Every isolated land produced its own brand of dinosaur. The fossil record tells this story with exquisite clarity. Where once paleontologists believed dinosaurs were similar across the globe, we now know the opposite was true. The breakup of Pangea explains why ceratopsians like Triceratops are found only in North America, why abelisaurids dominated South America and Africa, why tyrannosaurs ruled Asia and North America, but never the southern continents. Geography decided destiny. The division also hints at why dinosaurs, despite their dominance, could not withstand the final catastrophe at the end of the Cretaceous. When the asteroid struck, dinosaurs were not a unified global population. They were scattered, separated, adapted only to their corner of the world. Recovery was impossible when isolation had splintered their diversity into fragile pieces. The oceans that once nurtured their diversity also sealed their fate. But before that end came, the divided world of dinosaurs was one of unparalleled spectacle. Imagine standing on a shore of the young Atlantic, perhaps in what is now Brazil. To the west, vast herds of titanosaurs roam, shaking the earth with each step. To the east, across the waters, enormous predators stalk the river deltas of Africa, unseen but terrifying in their presence. Between them lies an ocean, growing wider every year. They will never meet, never compete, never cross paths. Yet both are part of the same story, written by the hand of drifting continents. The world that dinosaurs inherited after Pangea was not smaller, it was richer, more complex, more alive than ever before. But it was a world carved into fragments, a kingdom divided by oceans. And in that division, evolution flourished. The reign of dinosaurs was no longer about global dominance. It was about local empires, unique kingdoms scattered across the earth. The breakup of Pangea did not end their story, it multiplied it, branching it into 1,000 directions. For 150 million years, those branches would fill every corner of the planet, until the final blow came. The supercontinent was gone. The oceans had risen, and the dinosaurs, once united, now ruled a divided Earth. Chapter 12, a changing planet. By the time Pangea had fully fractured, the Earth was no longer the same world it had once been. The quiet supercontinent of endless plains and unified ecosystems had transformed into something restless, dynamic, and unpredictable. Continents drifted like giant rafts, pulled apart by molten currents beneath the crust. Mountains rose and crumbled, oceans expanded and deepened, and coastlines twisted into new shapes with every passing million years. For the life that inhabited this shifting stage, dinosaurs, mammals, reptiles, insects, and plants' existence became an ongoing negotiation with change. Nothing stayed the same for long. And yet, in this instability lay opportunity. The breakup of Pangea did more than divide dinosaurs and separate ecosystems. It altered the very character of the planet itself. The moving continents, when you look at a modern world map, with Africa, South America, North America, Asia, and Australia all separated by vast oceans, it's easy to forget that they were once fused together. But the breakup of Pangea explains the very shapes of our continents today. The familiar puzzle piece, fit between the bulge of Brazil and the curve of West Africa, is no coincidence. It's a scar, a memory of a time when those lands were one dot. As Pangea fractured, rift valleys formed, deep scars where the crust stretched and thinned. Many of these rifts filled with water, birthing inland seas that eventually gave way to oceans. The Atlantic Ocean, for example, began as nothing more than a long crack that widened, drop by drop, into the vast expanse we see today. Each year, the Atlantic still grows a few centimeters wider, a quiet echo of the forces that first split Pangea. This movement also reshaped climates. Land masses that were once tucked into the interior of a massive supercontinent suddenly found themselves along coastlines, exposed to ocean breezes, storms, and fluctuating sea levels. Deserts turned to wetlands, and forests became dry savannas. The Earth was constantly redrawing its climate zones, oceans that changed everything. The opening of new oceans altered more than coastlines, it transformed currents. Before Pangea cracked, the ocean was dominated by a single massive current circling the supercontinent. Afterward, with new pathways forming, water began to circulate in complex patterns, redistributing heat around the globe. This change reshaped weather. Rainfall patterns shifted. Some continents grew wetter, supporting lush forests where none had been before. Others dried out, leaving behind deserts and scrublands. A diversity of environments gave rise to a diversity of life. Where once ecosystems had been somewhat uniform, now they splintered into distinct biomes. Marine life felt the change too. The new oceans became highways for evolution, offering new coastlines, shallow seas, and reef systems. With the split of Pangea, the stage was set for explosive bursts of marine biodiversity, from ammonites spiraling through shallow waters to the rise of new fish lineages that would dominate the seas for millions of years. The climate's wild swings, but the most profound change came from the climate itself. Earth entered a time of extremes, swinging between greenhouse heat and cooler interludes. The breakup of Pangea unleashed massive volcanic outpourings, spewing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere. This triggered greenhouse events, raising global temperatures, melting polar ice, and submerging coastlines beneath shallow seas. At the same time, the drifting of continents pushed some landmasses toward the poles. There, cold climates developed and seasonal extremes became harsher. For the first time in hundreds of millions of years, ecosystems faced a truly global patchwork of climates, from tropical wetlands to arid deserts to icy polar forests. Dinosaurs and other creatures adapted in surprising ways. In the north, some species learned to survive long polar nights, evolving strategies to withstand months of darkness. In the tropics, others grew larger, their bodies acting like natural radiators to manage heat. Evolution became not just about survival of the fittest predator or grazer, it was about surviving the planet's wild and unpredictable mood swings. The rise of new ecosystems, the Earth's changing face, allowed ecosystems to specialize. On one continent, giant conifer forests stretched for miles. On another, flowering plants began their quiet takeover, reshaping diets and behaviors. Grass had not yet evolved, but ferns, cycads, and early angiosperms painted the land in green mosaics that varied from place to place. Insects followed, diversifying alongside plants. Pollinators evolved in tandem with flowers, creating new networks of life. Small mammals, still in the shadows of the dinosaurs, experimented with different forms, taking advantage of niches left open in fragmented ecosystems. The changing world favored experimentation. Species that could not adapt disappeared. Those that could grew stranger, more diverse, more specialized. A planet in transition. Looking back, it's tempting to think of Earth as a place where continents simply drifted apart. But the reality was far more violent. The world shook with earthquakes, rift valleys tore open landscapes, volcanoes poured lava across entire regions, and climates swung like pendulums. For life on Earth, this was both a crucible and a canvas. Evolution was tested, challenged, and reshaped in ways that would never have happened on a static, unchanging world. The dinosaurs we marvel at today, the horned giants, the towering sauropods, the deadly predators, owe their very existence to this age of change. Pangea's breakup was not an end. It was a beginning. It was the transformation of a planet into the fractured, diverse, unpredictable Earth we recognize today. And yet, even as new worlds emerged, even as continents carved their own destinies, this changing planet carried within it the seeds of future cataclysms. The Earth was alive, and its story of upheaval was far from over. Chapter 13 echoes in today's Earth. When we look at the modern world map, it feels permanent. Africa seems forever locked in its shape, the Americas appear fixed in their positions, and the Atlantic Ocean looks timeless, as though it has always been there. But beneath the illusion of stability, the Earth still carries the fingerprints of Pangea, the scars, the memories, the echoes of a world that once was whole, even though the supercontinent shattered nearly 200 million years ago. Its legacy is everywhere, hiding in plain sight. In mountains, in coastlines, in rocks, even in the creatures that walk the Earth today. The story of Pangea has never truly disappeared. The puzzle pieces of the continents, perhaps, the most obvious reminder is the jigsaw fit of the continents themselves. Anyone who has looked at a globe has noticed it. The bulge of South America seems to nestle perfectly into the curve of West Africa. This is no accident. It is the frozen outline of a rift, a place where continents once tore apart and drifted away from one another. Other coastlines tell the same tale. The eastern seaboard of North America aligns with northwestern Africa. Greenland mirrors Scandinavia. India's journey across the Indian Ocean is marked by a trail of scars left in the seafloor. What we see as geography is really history evidence of a world in motion, shaped by the slow but relentless churn of tectonic plates. Mountains as ancient scars. Look closer at the mountains, and the echoes of Pangea are even louder. The Appalachian Mountains in North America do not stand alone. Their ancient rocks, twisted and folded, are identical to those found in Scotland, Ireland, and Norway. Once, they were part of the same mountain chain, born when continents collided to form Pangea. Today, separated by an ocean, they stand as broken pieces of the same colossal scar. The Atlas Mountains of North Africa and the ranges in Brazil also share this hidden kinship. Like stitches holding together a wound, they are geological reminders of the violent sutures that bound Pangea together. Every mountain range that formed in those collisions whispers the same story. Once, we were one. Fossils that cross oceans, but the echoes of Pangea are not carved only into rock, they are preserved in life itself. Fossils tell a tale of creatures that roamed freely across a united supercontinent. The reptile Mesosaurus, for instance, lived in freshwater lakes. Its fossils are found both in Brazil and in southern Africa, an impossibility if those continents had always been separate. The distribution only makes sense if they were once connected. The plant Glossopteris, with its distinctive fern-like leaves, appears in fossil beds across India, South America, Africa, and Antarctica. It once spread across Gondwana, the southern half of Pangea, its range a living map of a land long gone. Even the great dinosaurs bear the imprint of division. The reason we find tyrannosaurs in Asia and North America, but not in South America or Africa, is because oceans had already risen to divide them. Their fossils are echoes not just of life, but of drifting continents and expanding seas. Clues beneath our feet. The ocean floor holds its own memory of Pangea. Along the mid-Atlantic ridge, a scar runs like a zipper down the center of the ocean. It marks the place where North and South America drift away from Europe and Africa, the very seam where Pangea tore apart. Lava still erupts there, pushing the continents ever farther apart. The Atlantic, in other words, is still being born. Magnetic stripes on the seafloor patterns locked in by the Earth's shifting magnetic field act like a tape recorder of this process. They show us how the ocean grew, inch by inch, over millions of years. It is as if the Earth itself kept a diary of Pangea's breakup, etched into basalt beneath the waves. The legacy in today's climate and life even. Today's climate carries the echoes of Pangea. The circulation of winds and currents, the placement of deserts and rainforests, all stem from the arrangement of continents set in motion when Pangea split. The Sahara Desert, for instance, owes its existence partly to the way Africa drifted into its current latitude, carrying old scars of Pangea into a new climate zone, the very distribution of species we see today. Why marsupials flourish in Australia, why lemurs are found only in Madagascar, why camels once thrived in North America before migrating can be traced back to the supercontinent's division. Isolation shaped them. Oceans, born from Pangea's cracks, dictated their destinies. A world still in motion, and perhaps the most haunting echo is this: Pangea's story isn't finished. The continents are still moving. The Atlantic is still widening. The Pacific is slowly shrinking. Geologists predict that in 200 to 300 million years, the continents may once again converge into a new supercontinent, Pangea Proxima or Aurica, depending on the model. If that happens, future species may once again walk a united world. Deserts will shift, mountains will rise, oceans will disappear. The earth will write a new chapter in the same ancient cycle. The whisper of memory, so the echoes of Pangea are all around us. They are in the stones of old mountain ranges, in the fossils that span continents, in the lines of coastlines that once kissed and then pulled apart. They are in the very air and water, in the patterns of winds and currents that sculpt our weather. The world we know today is not separate from that ancient time. It is a direct descendant, shaped by it in every way. Every time you trace a map, hike a mountain trail, or hold a fossil, you are touching a piece of Pangea's memory. The earth is not forgotten. And neither should we. Chapter 14. What if Pangea never broke? Speculation is one of science's most thrilling tools. Fossils and rocks tell us what happened. But sometimes the most fascinating question is, what if it hadn't? Pangea, the great supercontinent, split apart around 200 million years ago, scattering the lands into the continents we know today. That breakup shaped everything: climates, ecosystems, the rise and fall of species, even human history. But imagine for a moment that the Earth's crust had remained still. Imagine that the fiery rifts never tore it apart, that the seas never widened, that the continents remained fused in one endless expanse of land. What would our world look like if Pangea never broke? A different map, a different Earth. The first thing we'd notice is the geography. Instead of oceans dividing continents, we'd see one massive, sprawling landmass wrapped around the equator, surrounded by a single global ocean, what geologists once called Panthalassa. The familiar shapes of Africa, Europe, Asia, and the Americas would be gone, blurred together into a single titan of rock and soil. Coastlines would be limited to the outer edges. Much of the interior would lie thousands of miles from the sea. That interior would be harsh. Today, oceans act like Earth's air conditioner, circulating heat and moisture around the planet. But with most of the land locked into a single block, the deep interior would be dry, hot, and barren. Instead of lush forests and grasslands, vast deserts would dominate the center of Pangea. Life would cling to the coasts, where ocean winds could bring rain, and rivers could nourish fertile plains. Evolution's different path now. Consider the creatures. On our real Earth, the breakup of Pangea forced dinosaurs, mammals, and countless other species into isolation, allowing them to evolve separately. But if the continents had never drifted apart, that evolutionary engine would have stalled. Dinosaurs might have been less diverse. Instead of unique lineages arising in South America, Africa, Asia, and North America, there would have been more uniformity across the supercontinent. The specialized giants of Gondwana, like Spinosaurus and Argentinosaurus, might never have evolved. Tyrannosaurs might never have become apex predators in the north. Without isolation, there would be fewer evolutionary experiments, fewer bizarre forms shaped by unique environments. Mammals, too, might never have risen as they did. The breakup of Pangea created isolated ecosystems where small, adaptable creatures flourished. On an unbroken Pangea, those mammals would have faced stronger, unified dinosaur lineages with no fractured habitats to exploit. The age of mammals may have been delayed or perhaps never have come at all. Oceans without borders, the oceans, too, would be unrecognizable. Today's circulation of currents like the Gulf Stream, which warms Europe, or the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, which isolates Antarctica, depends on the placement of continents. Without that breakup, there would be no Atlantic Ocean, no Mediterranean, no Caribbean, no Indian Ocean. Instead, Panthalassa would dominate, a single vast body of water with slower, less complex circulation. That would mean a more extreme climate. Coastal regions might experience monsoons and floods, while the interior baked under deserts. Ice ages might strike harder without continents to break up ocean currents. Storms would rage across open water, larger and more destructive than anything we know today. Human history on Pangea. What about us? If Pangea had never split, human history would have unfolded on a very different stage. Instead of continents separated by oceans, our species would have spread across one connected landmass. There would be no need for seafaring to reach distant lands, no great voyages of discovery, no isolation of cultures, no Americas cut off from Eurasia and Africa until the last few centuries. The diversity of human civilizations might have been far less dramatic. Instead of thousands of unique cultures shaped by isolated geography, we might have seen more interconnected societies, exchanging ideas and technologies across the supercontinent from the beginning. Agriculture, writing, and metallurgy might have spread faster, but perhaps innovation itself would have been slower, without the sparks of contrast and isolation. Would there have been empires that stretched across the entire supercontinent? Or would deserts and mountains have acted as insurmountable barriers, dividing humanity in other ways? The political map of Pangea is a tantalizing mystery we'll never see, but it's fascinating to imagine the hidden danger of staying whole. It's tempting to think a united supercontinent would have been stable, but in truth, it may have been a death trap for life. The interior deserts would have been brutal, and climates more extreme. Without the geological recycling that comes from breaking continents apart, ecosystems might have grown stale, species less diverse, and extinction events more catastrophic. In fact, some scientists argue that the breakup of Pangea was crucial to life's success. The separation of continents created countless ecological niches, fostering biodiversity and resilience. Without that, life might have been more vulnerable to global disasters. A single asteroid impact, a single massive volcanic eruption, could have wiped out far more species in a unified world than in a divided one. The cycle that never stops. But perhaps the most important point is this: even if Pangea had never broken in the Mesozoic, the Earth's restless plates would not have stayed still forever. The supercontinent cycle is as old as the planet itself. Eventually, rifts would have torn Pangea apart, whether 200 million years ago or 200 million years in the future. The breakup was inevitable. Pangea's story is not just about what happened. It's about what always happens. Continents gather, continents break, and life changes with them. If Pangea had never split when it did, life on Earth would be different, maybe profoundly so. But the rhythm of the planet would still have carried us to another supercontinent cycle, another reshaping of the Earth, the mirror of what if. So when we ask, what if Pangea never broke? We're really asking something deeper. How much of Earth's story depends on chance, and how much on inevitability? Did the breakup of Pangea create us, the mammals who rose in its wake, the humans who eventually spread across the continents? Or would we, or something like us, have emerged regardless on the back of some other planetary cycle? The truth is unknowable. But the echoes of Pangea remind us that the world we walk today, its oceans, its climates, its diversity, its history, is not inevitable. It is the product of tectonic restlessness, of chance collisions, of drifting land. Without the breakup of Pangea, the world would have been simpler. But it also might have been emptier. Chapter 15, Pangea's Legacy. How the story of Pangea still shapes the continents and our future. Picture the Earth as it is today. Continents scattered across a blue ocean planet. Mountain chains zigzagging across landscapes. Deserts sprawling for thousands of miles. Rainforests teeming with life. At first glance, it all feels permanent, as though the world has always been like this, and always will be. But the truth is far more extraordinary. The world we see today is simply one chapter in a much longer story. And at the heart of that story is Pangea, the great supercontinent that came together more than 300 million years ago and later shattered, giving birth to the continents and oceans we know. Even though Pangea itself disappeared over 175 million years ago, its influence lingers everywhere, in the shape of coastlines, in the placement of mountains, in the patterns of life, and even in the future that still lies ahead of us. Pangea's story is not finished. It continues to shape the world beneath our feet and the world our descendants will inherit, the memory written in stone when Alfred Wegener first suggested in 1912 that continents drifted like icebergs across the surface of the earth. People laughed. Continents were too big, too solid. How could they possibly move? But Wegener had seen the clues fossils of the same reptile, Mesosaurus, in both Africa and South America. Identical rock layers on opposite sides of the Atlantic. Ancient climate evidence that didn't match the continent's modern positions. Wegener died before his theory was accepted, but today his vision has become the foundation of modern geology. Pangea was the proof. It explained why Africa and South America fit together so neatly. It explained why mountain ranges like the Appalachians in North America line up perfectly with ranges in Morocco. It explained how life could spread across the world long before humans ever set sail. Pangea gave us not only a past to marvel at, but a scientific revolution. The acceptance of plate tectonics reshaped our understanding of everything from earthquakes to volcanoes to the deep history of life. The legacy in landscapes. Look at a map of the world today, and you're still looking at the scars of Pangea. The Atlantic Ocean is the direct child of Pangea's breakup, a widening wound that began as a crack between Africa and North America. The Himalayas exist because India, once an island drifting after Pangea's breakup, slammed into Asia. The Andes Mountains rise because South America, another shard of Pangea, is being forced over oceanic crust. Even deserts and rainforests carry Pangea's fingerprints. The Sahara's arid expanse is partly the result of continental drift, altering global wind patterns. The Amazon rainforest flourishes because of moisture carried from the Atlantic, an ocean that would never have existed without Pangea's split. Every mountain, every river system, every coastline tells the story of that ancient supercontinent. Without Pangea, the Earth would not only look different, it would be different. The shaping of life and humanity. Pangea also transformed life itself. When all land was connected, animals and plants spread freely across its vast interior. Dinosaurs roamed from what is now North America to what is now Asia. Primitive mammals and reptiles shared habitats that stretched across thousands of miles. But when Pangea cracked, life was divided. New oceans became barriers, isolating species and forcing them to evolve independently. This is why marsupials dominate Australia, while placental mammals dominate elsewhere. It's why South America developed unique wildlife like giant sloths and terror birds, while Africa fostered elephants and lions. Even humanity's story was shaped by this. The breakup of continents created the environments where humans eventually evolved savannas in Africa, fertile valleys in Asia, grasslands in Europe. Later, the separation of continents influenced the spread of civilizations, forcing cultures to develop in isolation before reconnecting through exploration. Had Pangea never broken, history itself might have looked unrecognizable. Lessons for the future. Most profound part of Pangea's legacy is that it is not over. The continents are still moving. The Red Sea is slowly widening, a baby ocean being born as Africa splits apart. The Pacific is shrinking as plates are pushed beneath surrounding continents. In tens of millions of years, Australia will collide with Asia, eventually. Whether in 200 or 300 million years, the continents will join again in a new supercontinent. Scientists call it a Messiah or Pangea Proxima. This cycle, supercontinents forming and breaking, has happened many times in Earth's past. Pangea was just one in a long sequence, following older supercontinents like Rodinia and Columbia. The Earth will continue this cycle long after humanity is gone. But knowing this gives us perspective. It reminds us that the world we live in is fleeting, that the oceans and continents we take for granted are temporary shapes in an endless dance. The human meaning of Pangea. Does this matter to us? Because Pangea forces us to confront both the power and fragility of the Earth. On the one hand, it shows us that nothing is permanent. The ground beneath our feet moves. Oceans open and close. Mountains rise and erode away. Civilizations that see themselves as eternal are, in geological terms, brief sparks against an ever-shifting backdrop. On the other hand, it reminds us that change is also opportunity. Just as life rebounded after extinctions, adapting to new continents and climates, so too can humanity adapt to the changes ahead. Climate shifts, resource challenges, migrations, these are not new. They are echoes of the same forces that once split Pangea apart. Pangea is both a warning and a source of wonder. It warns us that stability is an illusion. But it also inspires us by showing that from upheaval comes diversity, creativity, and new beginnings. A story without an ending. So what, finally, is Pangea's legacy? It is the reminder that Earth is alive. It is the proof that change is constant. It is the story of how continents shape life, and life adapts in return. It is the humbling truth that humanity is part of this grand process, not separate from it. Pangea's breakup gave us the world as we know it, the continents we live on, the oceans we sail, the climates we endure, the diversity of species that surround us. And someday, in the distant future, another supercontinent will form, carrying on the story. The legacy of Pangea is that it never truly ended. It lives on in our maps, our fossils, our earthquakes, our coastlines, and in the curiosity that drives us to understand the planet we call home. When you look at a globe, you're not just seeing the present. You're seeing the aftermath of a colossal rupture. You're seeing the scars of a world that once was whole. And you're seeing the promise of a future that will be reshaped again. That is the legacy of Pangea. The greatest story our Earth has ever told, and the one it is still telling.